So welcome everyone, and thanks to Barbara and Erin and everyone else who has organized this conference. It's a privilege for me to be here, and it's a privilege really for me to be a law professor at Villanova. I love my job, and I feel so fortunate of the work that my students and I have been able to accomplish. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. But I'm so glad to see so many people in the room today because refugees and immigrants need our compassion, our help, our welcome today more than ever in recent history. And it's great to be talking about Pope Francis because I see him as a steady, loud, resounding voice on the need to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate migrants and refugees into our communities. I think it was really significant that he visited the refugee camps in Lampedusa within months of being named our Pope. And in an effort to promote Catholic teaching about migration, there's a national effort organized by Catholic Relief Services and Clinic called Share the Journey. And it's an effort to educate the Catholic community about refugee issues. I kind of see this talk as part of that broader mission. So I'll begin my talk by providing a short overview of Catholic social teaching on migration. And then after that short introduction, I'm going to show a call of action by Pope Francis to and talk about his positions on migration, particularly with respect to international negotiations that are taking place right now at the UN about migrants and refugees. And then we're going to do a quick exercise. It's the afternoon of a long conference, so I'm going to get us doing a think, pair, share exercise. And then I'll end with a discussion of Pope Francis's recent call on Catholic universities to do more to promote and protect refugees, and an effort here at Villanova to advance that mission. So let's start with an overview of Pope Francis, of just Catholic social thought in general about migration. As you know, the Church has a long history of promoting and protecting migrants and refugees, and CST provides answers to three pressing questions about migration. The first one is, who can migrate? The second is, where can they migrate to? And the third is, how should they be treated when they migrate by the receiving country? So with respect to the question of who can migrate, CST implicitly divides migrants and refugees into migrants into three categories. The first is refugees, the second is migrants, and the third is skilled and educated migrants. So this first group, refugees. As to refugees, CST recognizes a very strong right to migrate. As the US and Mexican bishops said in a joint pastoral letter, the right to migrate must never be denied when people's lives are truly threatened in their homeland. This position is similar, though not identical, to the right of a refugee to migrate under US and international law. US and international law provides that countries are obligated not to deport someone to a country if they're unable to return because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So this language comes from an international treaty, the Convention relating to the status of refugees. And that treaty was negotiated and drafted after World War II in 1951 to respond to the displacement of so many people in Europe. There was a protocol to the convention that was signed by the US in 1967, and that's the basis for our laws in the United States on refugee protection, and the laws in many other countries around the world that are signatories to that convention. And I say that this international position is similar, but not identical to the church's, because the church's teachings are even more broader with respect to who qualifies as a refugee. So, for example, Catholic social teaching considers the term refugee appropriately to include not only people who fear persecution because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, but also individuals who are compelled to leave their home country for reasons such as climate change, natural disaster, famine, severe economic deprivation, or war. So that's the first group, refugees. With respect to the second group of migrants, those who are not fleeing dire situations, they're referred to generally in CST as migrants. And for this group, CST also adopts a very strong message of welcome. Pope John Paul II said that man has a right to leave his home, his native country, for various motives, and also to return in order to seek better conditions of life in another country. So the most common non-emergency motive for migrating is economic opportunity. And according to Catholic social teaching, the right to migrate for economic reasons stems from the right to support oneself and to the duty to sustain one's family. So this is the second category of migrants. And then the third category is skilled and educated migrants. I'm not going to talk a lot about that topic here today, but I address it in a book that I wrote. It's about Catholic social teaching on migration, called Stepping Out of the Brain Drain, Catholic Social Teaching in a New Era of Migration. And there I argue that the church should think about all the contributions that skilled and educated migrants make in their home community and consider that when thinking about their position on migration of skilled and educated migrants. In general, I'll say here that the church has been, at best, a rather tepid supporter of this particular type of migration. CST suggests that the migration of skilled and educated people, particularly from developing to developed countries, can, in some circumstances, quote, gravely endanger the public good. That's from the Sacred Congregation for Bishops, a worldwide group of bishops almost 50 years ago. But you still hear similar things being said today. And there's a very notable contrast in tone between CST's position on refugees and migrants and its position on the migration of skilled and educated people. So that describes the three types of migrants. The second question is, where can they migrate to? With respect to refugees, people in dire life and death circumstances, the church has an essentially absolute position. Sovereign states have a duty to accept such people, as well as a duty to help them integrate into the home, the host community. With regard to the second group, ordinary migrants, Catholic social teaching acknowledges that the right to immigrate to a particular country may be more limited than with respect to the right of refugees. There's a recognition in the literature that a sovereign nation can regulate migration across its own borders because of the impact of migration on the receiving country's own citizens and residents. Now, US law agrees with this power, but there's a very big difference between US law and Catholic social thought regarding how and when a sovereign country can exercise its power to limit migration. As a matter of legal theory and legal power, it would be a perfectly acceptable US position in US law to exclude all migrants, except refugees who are physically present in the United States, because we're signatories to conventions that prevent us from deporting people who are refugees. Okay, that would be an absolutely terrible position, but purely as an exercise of legal power, it would be legitimate under US law. But CST has a different view. and it's almost a mirror image of the view of the United States legal theory. Current US law essentially excludes everyone and then makes exceptions for those who can come in. Catholic social teaching, in contrast, places a high burden on those who would limit migration. I'll quote here again from the Sacred Congregation of Bishops, and they say, public authorities unjustly deny rights of human persons if they block or impede emigration or immigration, except where grave requirements of the common good, considered objectively, demand it. I love that. Grave requirements of the common good, considered objectively, demand it. And the US and Mexican bishops added a qualification to that in 2003 and saying that not merely for the purpose of acquiring additional wealth. So the one place where the church has suggested that the high burden can, in some circumstances, be met involves skilled migration from underdeveloped countries to developed countries. So I've talked about migrants and where they can migrate. The third topic that CST talks about is how immigrants should be treated in the receiving country. And this time the answer is a little simpler. Every category of migrant should be welcomed into their new community, regardless of their motivation for migrating. In effect, upon arrival across the border, the church merges all three types of migrants into a fourth type, the newcomer, and insists that newcomers across the board are treated with dignity and respect. Now, all of these positions are derived from some foundational principles of Catholic social doctrine, particularly the principles of human dignity and the common good. So human dignity, of course, is a sacred gift of creation. Every person possesses it, and it's not dependent upon achievement, worth, or value of any kind. The other foundational principle is that of the common good. This principle flows from the communitarian nature of humans, which reflects the Trinitarian nature of our faith. And relationships with family and community are necessary for us to develop and flourish. So how these two principles of common good and human dignity relate and work together is a pretty complex topic and subject as it applies to migration. And it adds an additional layer of complexity. So you get the question, like, how do you define the community? Is it the community of the receiving country, or the common good of the sending country, or both? So obviously there's no scale to provide exact measures. I think what the church teaching does, in a general sense, is to provide an orientation that would encourage us to recognize more completely the ways various circumstances around the world can constitute an assault on human dignity. And then from a position of empathy and understanding, to think about that impact on various human communities. In his encyclical Centesimus Annus, Pope John Paul II provided a model for this sort of approach. And I'll end this part of my talk with a quotation from that encyclical. So many people do not have the means which would enable them to take their place in an effective and humanly dignified way within a productive system in which work is truly central. They have no possibility of acquiring the basic knowledge which would enable them to express their creativity and develop their potential. They have no way of entering the network of knowledge and intercommunication that would enable them to see their qualities appreciated and utilized. Thus, if not actually exploited, they are to a great extent marginalized. Economic development takes place over their head, so to speak. Their dignity is not acknowledged in any real way. It is a strict duty of justice and truth not to allow fundamental human needs to remain unsatisfied. It is also necessary to help those needy people to acquire expertise, to enter the circle of exchange and to develop their skills in order to make the best use of their capabilities. There exists something which is due to man because he is man, by reason of his lofty dignity. So those are, I think, very thought-provoking words on how various conditions around the world can constitute an assault on human dignity. And when we think about migration, we need to begin our thought process with those assaults on human dignity in mind. We have to ask ourselves, how do we propose to address them? Morally, the answer cannot be to do nothing. From this understanding, in our current age and in our current circumstances, migration begins to appear not only a possible response to worldwide assaults on human dignity, but a necessary one. And I think we can say with confidence that this is, in fact, the view of Pope Francis on migration. In fact, he's emphasized in his work 4 points with respect to migration. The first one is really interesting because it implicitly recognizes that it's a shame that migration is necessary in order to achieve human dignity. And that's the right to remain in one's home country. So, a hallmark of Pope Francis's teaching on migration is that people should be able to remain in their home country and live there and live a fruitful life there, where they have dignity, where they have opportunity for economic advancement, where they're not suffering from persecution, violence, or anything. So in this regard, he cares about investment in sustainable development so that people, when they choose to migrate, they're doing it voluntarily and not because the circumstances in their community are forcing them to migrate. So that's Pope Francis's first key point. The second is the right to migrate. And with respect to that, the Pope believes that we need many more safe, legal, and regular pathways for migration, so that people are not forced underground to take paths that lead to exploitation and danger. So what we see today is that when there are no legal modes of migration, people end up resorting to things that are dangerous and that put them into vulnerable situations. So migrants who travel on the Mediterranean Sea, as Barbara noted, I worked in Malta, right when Malta became a signatory to the convention, and for the first time had to respond to boatloads of migrants coming over the sea from Tunisia and from Libya. And it was it was sad. It was so impactful to see to understand what that journey meant to people, what they needed to sacrifice along the way, and how many bodies were found in the Mediterranean. People refer to it as a human graveyard. And it's also people who because there are no legal modes of migration, end up walking through deserts without water and dying in the deserts, or being exploited by smugglers, or worse, human trafficking. That's all, in Pope Francis's view, because we don't have safe, legal, regular modes of migration. The third is the right to the necessities of life. So with respect to that, Pope Francis is focusing on making certain that migrants and refugees have access to basic services necessary for life when they migrate to their new community. So we're talking about water, sanitation, education, healthcare, and safe living conditions. It's a really holistic and integrated approach with a focus on the centrality of the human person. The church has actually been pushing really hard on this in the international negotiations that I'll talk about in a minute, because the Pope sees this as really important for integral human development. And then fourth, this pontificate is very focused on protecting vulnerable populations. A few of the most vulnerable are unaccompanied children. Just a few weeks ago, I was at the UN at an event that the Holy See mission to the UN organized on preventing and eliminating detention of unaccompanied children and thinking about alternatives to detention. And another group that the church is very focused on is victims of human trafficking. And so what the Pope is doing and the pontificate is doing is now, these are the four kind of foundational principles that they're working on making sure get incorporated into two international efforts that are taking place with respect to migrants and refugees. So as you might know, the world is coming together right now to negotiate two compacts. One is the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And this is the first ever intergovernmentally negotiated agreement that seeks to cover all dimensions of international migration in a comprehensive manner. And it's being prepared and drafted under the auspices of the UN. The second is the Global Compact on Refugees. That is comprised of a comprehensive refugee response framework and a program of action. The program of action is like how to get the framework to work in real life. And that's being negotiated in Geneva. And these two compacts are the product of a first ever UN summit on migration and refugee protection that took place in September 2016 at the UN. So it was the first time ever that members of the global community, heads of states, government officials, came together to discuss on a comprehensive level issues relating to migrants and refugees. And with respect to the Global Compact on Migration, the first draft of that compact was released in February, a second draft in March, and they're being drafted now by member states from around the world, except notably the United States withdrew from negotiations a few months ago. And the goal is that the negotiations will result in a document that will be signed December 10th and 11th in Morocco. And the Vatican is playing a really key role in these negotiations. The Vatican has been a moral voice in the process, and interestingly, can vote on the document. So I understand that there's hope and expectation that Pope Francis will actually be there for the signing of the document, of course, if the final version meets with his approval. So these negotiations are taking place in New York at the UN, and the Holy See's mission to the UN is very active on a day-to-day basis. Papal Nuncio Auza and his team are negotiating this. And Chris and I and Megan have been asked to be advisors to them on issues related to what's going on at the UN. And they're also working very closely with the Dicastery on Integral Human Development, which has a section on migrants and refugees. And I note that the creation of that section in and of itself is significant because it shows how important this Pope considers the issues of migrants and refugees. So in connection with the work at the UN, the Pope created this video, which I'd like to share with you now.
Le migrazioni nelle loro diverse forme non rappresentano certo un fenomeno nuovo nella storia dell'umanità. Esse hanno marcato profondamente ogni epoca, favorendo l'incontro dei popoli e la nascita di nuove civiltà. gran parte dei casi si tratta di spostamenti causati da conflitti, disastri naturali, persecuzioni, cambiamenti climatici, violenze, povertà estrema e condizioni di vita indebite. La nostra comune risposta si poteva articolare attorno a 4 verbi: accogliere, proteggere, promuovere e integrare. Accogliere. Un'accoglienza responsabile e dignitosa di questi nostri fratelli e sorelle comincia dalla loro prima sistemazione in spazi adeguati e decorosi. Proteggere. Parliamo di milioni di lavoratori e lavoratrici migranti e tra questi particolarmente quelli in situazione irregolare, di profughi e richiedenti asilo, di vittime della tratta, la difesa dei loro diritti inalienabili, la garanzia delle libertà fondamentali e il rispetto della loro dignità sono compiti da cui nessuno si può esimere. Promuovere. Proteggere non basta, occorre promuovere lo sviluppo umano integrale di migranti, profughi e rifugiati. La promozione umana dei migranti e delle loro famiglie comincia dalle comunità di origine, là dove essere garantito, assieme al diritto di poter migrare, anche il diritto di non dover migrare. Integrare. L'integrazione che non è né assimilazione né incorporazione, è un processo bidirezionale che si fonda essenzialmente sul mutuo riconoscimento della ricchezza culturale dell'altro. Credo che coniugare questi 4 verbi in prima persona singolare e in prima persona plurale rappresenti oggi un dovere.
So, yeah, right? So now I'd like us all to engage in a little exercise. We're handing out index cards, which you can use, or you can just use a piece of paper. But what I'd like you to think about for 2 minutes is what you or your community can do to respond to Pope Francis's call to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate refugees and migrants. And then after we write it down individually, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and share what you've written down with that person. And then ask a few of you to, so that's the pair part, sorry. And then ask you to a few of you to share it with the broader group. So this exercise shouldn't take that long, just a few minutes. We're handing out index cards now, or you can just write on a paper. So the question is, what can you do or your community do to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate migrants and refugees? So 2 minutes. Oh, you got one. Oh, good. Okay, so everyone has. Good. So if you've written it down, I'd like to invite you to share what you've written down with somebody seated near you. So pair with somebody sitting near you, groups of 2 or 3, and I'm like running out of time. Okay, I'm going to call you back so that we can. Hello? All right, keep going, keep going. All right, I'll give you 1 more minute. All right. I'm going to ask for. Is this. Hello? No. Hello? 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 Yes. Okay. So, is anyone willing to share with the group what you came up with? Okay, good. Yeah. Stand up.
Well, I guess they bring up the issue of negative attitudes towards undocumented and with family and some friends.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little more militant. It's 4:00. Be militant. Demand access to the immigration jails, not detention centers. They're really jails where they're holding women and children, like the one that's not far from where we are today. My daughter works for Human Rights First and had the opportunity to visit that particular center where there are no translators, where women and their children are separated. And it's just inhumane, and I believe it goes against everything I believe is Catholic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she's talking about Berks County has a jail that one of the only in the country that detains women and children. We've done work in that jail over the years. Anyone else? Ruth, good.
We are really lucky to have a group from representing Nigeria, Colombia, and the U.S. And and So interestingly, we came up with some very similar things of making relationships with the immigrant or refugee, but then also educating others about the needs and the importance of welcome. And in the U.S., not only educating the community, but our policymakers, and then voting.
Yeah, big one. Can you come grab it? Pass this down.
So,
Whoa.
so
John and I are from Cincinnati, and we belong to the Jesuit parish on Xavier's campus called Bellarmine. And our pastor, Dan Hartnett, said that he had been contacted by the Kino Border Institute, which is on the U.S.-Mexican border right outside of Juarez, and that they had a family that was fleeing, seeking asylum from gang activity in El Salvador. And he brought it to the parish and said, we've been asked if we could bring in, take in this family from El Salvador. And he said that he received over 200 emails from the parish, not one opposed to the idea of welcoming.
Wow.
So that was almost a year ago. The family has been with us. Their asylum case will be finally brought to the courts this summer after a long time. But there are hundreds and hundreds of parishioners who are in the email chain to help curry them all over the city, help them find employment. So anyway, I just wanted to bring it up because if we can do it in Cincinnati, then every
Mr. Torres, I'm an immigration attorney actually, so I deal with this every day. But I can tell you my biggest concern is that we need a lot of education in our parishes. And if our parish leaders, our priests, do not speak, nobody's going to listen. I mean, nobody's going to know about it. In my parish, for example, very few times the priest says, I was a stranger and you welcome me. That's the only thing they say. And now that we have had the DACA issue, in my office I have 60 DACAs. And we have 800,000 in the United States. And it has been discussed in Congress. The president just terminated the program. And now, thanks to the courts, they're still being able to apply. I mean, the ones that have DACA already. No new ones can apply. So it's a huge issue at this moment. Never it has been so terrible.
Yeah.
Tony and I did this together. I think the main problem in the parishes I am acquainted with the Palm Beach County area. I mean, most Catholics, and it is safe to say most Catholics don't realize that this is not politics. They call it politics. And I try to tell them it's an essential part of the gospel. It's not an option for a Catholic. It's an essential part of the gospel. And, well, I've been labeled a communist, socialist, and can't remember or whatever. I taught at the Catholic Seminary for 30 years, and many of my former students are now parish pastors or parish vicars and so on. And I've talked to a number of them. They tell me they're afraid to preach on these things because the wealthy donors of the parish will leave the parish or refuse to give money for the new rectories and new marble altars and so on and so forth. This is the reality. I'm not generalizing here. I'm sure that the parish I belong to, St. Mark's, is run by Franciscans who do live the spirit of Il Poverello well. I mean, they have welcome migrants and so on, but that is an exception. That is an exception, not the rule.
Well, that was great. I appreciate everybody participating. And I just want to, at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned Share the Journey campaign. So that's actually a campaign. There are materials on the web that are available for parishes to educate their communities about the gospel and the social teachings on migration. So we have one more, and then I still have some more other things I want to share.
I wanted to say something about our treatment of other lands. Many of the people who are trying to come to the United States are fleeing conditions created by U.S. multinational corporations.
Yes.
And this is separate with the parallel issue is our treatment of the people who lived here before we called this place America.
Right.
And they have not been assimilated we took over.
Right. Yeah, so those are great points. Okay. So I just have a few more things I wanted to talk about. So let me see if I can do it quickly. So Pope Francis recently attended a conference that was hosted by the International Federation of Catholic Universities in Rome. And they had a papal visit. It was so amazing, I think. So it was a conference on migrants and refugees. And so he called on Catholic universities to work with migrants and refugees in 4 areas. One is research. And there he said, it's appropriate to initiate further studies on the remote causes of forced migrations with the aim of identifying practical solutions. So also in the long term, as it is necessary first to ensure that people have a right not to be forced to emigrate. So that's that point I mentioned earlier. It's equally important to reflect on the negative, sometimes discriminatory, and xenophobic first reactions to migrants in countries of ancient Christian tradition, to propose paths for raising awareness. Furthermore, greater appreciation is due to the many contributions migrants and refugees bring to their societies that welcome them, as well as those that benefit their countries, their communities of origin. So with respect to that, those of you who teach students, there's so many interesting issues. Students are always looking for research projects, and there are so many interesting issues that come out and that are related to migrants and refugees. So in terms of promoting and responding to Pope Francis's call, I could think about students with a business focus could look at how small businesses that are run by immigrants and refugees in the community are impacting the viability of certain communities. Students of economics could research economic contributions of migrants and refugees, both in their host communities, but also in their sending countries. My own research has looked a little bit at that. Cultural studies or rhetoric students could add to our understanding of xenophobia. And history students could show the similarities in rhetoric about immigration over time, how the argument pretty much remains the same. It's just different immigrant groups that are substituted in. I'm always taken by how much what was said about Italians 100 years ago, my grandfather came from Sicily in 1921, is being said today, the same words about Central Americans and Mexicans. And the same is true with Irish 2 generations before. So these are some ideas in terms of research. The second thing that the Pope asked Catholic universities and colleges to do is to train in a specific and professional way the pastoral workers who are dedicated to the assistance of migrants and refugees, and to educate their students, some of whom will become political leaders, businessmen, and formers of culture, in a careful understanding of the migratory phenomenon from a perspective of justice, global co-responsibility, and communion and cultural diversity. We're actually working on a project here at Villanova that I'd like to, if I have a minute, talk about at the end. And then the third thing that he asks is that communities think about social promotion of refugees and migrants. So universities can perform their role as privileged actors also in the social field by, for example, providing incentives for students volunteering in aid programs for refugees, asylum seekers, and newly arrived immigrants. And of course, parishes can do that too, and we had a few examples of that earlier. So I'm going to end, I have 5 minutes left, just to talk a little bit about a program that I'm working on here at Villanova, which I'm so excited about. I feel really privileged to be able to do this. So as a lawyer, I go into immigration court, and I know my colleague will say the same. And it's always devastating because the courtroom is jammed wall to wall with immigrants. In the courtroom that I appear in, it's a windowless room with no ventilation. The air is still. Mothers are comforting their infants. Toddlers are wiggling in the seat, and you actually hear a methodical beeping. You realize it's coming from a bracelet attached to a woman's ankle by the government so that they can monitor her every move. And in that room, there is so much confusion. People are confused about the law, confused about the procedure, confused about what's going to happen when their name is called. And usually, there's at most a handful of lawyers. So this supply-demand imbalance hits me. It's of lawyers. So most people appear in immigration court without a lawyer. The demand exceeds supply. And with a representative, the chances of success on the merits are so much higher. With a representative, an immigrant's chance of gaining relief from deportation is 12 times better. And it's crazy because it's really, there's so much confusion. Like, they don't know the law. There's cultural differences. There's language barriers. And also, working with asylum seekers like I do, I realize that it takes so much time just to get them to build up the courage and the trust to talk about the persecution that they've suffered. And then to have to make a legal claim and present it to court, it's almost impossible to do without a lawyer. So this supply-demand imbalance has really been kind of on my mind over these 20 years that I've been representing immigrants. And now I feel like I came up with a solution. And so many of you probably don't know, but there are regulations on the books that allow for non-lawyers to represent immigrants in immigration court and before the Department of Homeland Security. They're called, I'm kind of moving through this quickly. They're called accredited representatives, and they're authorized by the US government to provide legal services. Regrettably, there are only 2,000 accredited reps today in the United States. So I'm going to change that. I'm working with a group of professors here on campus, and we're creating the first ever online certificate program to train accredited representatives. So my goal is to train 10,000. I like lofty goals. And so it's called VISTA, Villanova Interdisciplinary Immigration Studies Training for Advocates. And we are working on it, as I said. Ruth is in the room. Father Art is in the room. We're working together on an interdisciplinary team to develop the curriculum. And then the goal is to launch it in 2 years with beta testing starting in the fall. And so I wanted to share that with you as an example of what we all can do to help to promote, welcome, protect refugees and migrants. So it's 4 o'clock. I stayed on time. Yeah, so everyone, yeah, so we're going to offer the program online, so it will be available to a diverse and geographically diverse audience. One of the things with immigration is a lot of the detention centers are located in remote locations, so it's really hard for people to get access to lawyers. So this way we can empower people in those local communities and train them to be advocates and represent immigrants that are being detained in those communities. I spoke recently to a woman who said that it's really hard, that there are organizations in Louisiana, for example, that want to hire immigration lawyers, but it's really hard because the lawyers don't want to move and stay and relocate in those communities. So wouldn't it be great to be able to empower people who live in those communities, who are there, doing it online, educating them, and then they can work in their own communities helping migrants and refugees. So that's the goal, and it's a really exciting opportunity. I feel really privileged to be here at Villanova with the support I'm getting.